Hello, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to everyone at EV Kids for this incredible honor. I'm so delighted to be here with you tonight. So when I thought about this year's theme, Ready to Launch, I thought that I would tell you a story, the story of how I launched myself into becoming an author. So as mentioned, I was born in India and immigrated to the US as a baby. And for the most part, I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky in the 70s and 80s. And I loved it there. I was a happy kid. I loved my school, my friends, my community. But sometimes I felt like two different people. I felt like an American at school with my friends, and I felt like an Indian on the weekends because I spent most of my weekends with my parents and our Indian American community. So sometimes I wondered which version was the real me, the weekday American or the weekend Indian. And sometimes I wondered whether either version was the real me. So we had no other relatives in the US, so seeing family meant traveling across the world. And every few years we would spend summers in India with my incredibly loving family. But walking down the street in Bangalore, it was clear that I wasn't truly Indian either. So sometimes I wondered whether there was a place anywhere in the world where I truly belonged. As a child, I loved reading. I loved realistic stories, mysteries, historical fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, you named it. I also loved comic books, including Indian comics called Amar Chitra Kathas, which tell stories from Indian history, mythology, and literature. And they taught me about my own culture in a way that I can't express how important it was to me. I also loved math and science. Can you tell I loved a lot of things? And there was an illustrated book called Ouch, all about cuts and other hurts, that inspired me to study medicine from a very young age. So I wrote creatively, essays, poems, even plays, throughout middle and high school. And one day when I was in my creative writing class in high school, I told my teacher, Mr. Hertzfeld, I said, I really love writing, but I know this is not going to be my career. I really hope someday I get to go to medical school. I really want to be a doctor. And he said something to me that changed my whole life. He said, "Who says you have to choose?" And the next day, he brought in all these books that were written by authors who happened to be doctors. And so that planted a seed in my head that sprouted many years later. And the seed was the idea that I didn't have to give up something I loved in order to do something else I loved. So when it was time to apply to college, even though I'm an only child and my parents knew they would miss me, they told me to go wherever I wanted and that they would support me. So I came here to Massachusetts and I never left. I met my husband Lou our freshman year at Harvard. And we became really good friends, and then maybe a little bit more than friends. And he was an EV Kids tutor starting freshman year. And that was the start of my relationship with EV Kids and all the wonderful work that they do. So I'm just so delighted about that. In college, sticking to my theme of loving many things, I was a government major who also was pre-med. And in my senior year, I remember taking a class called The Literature of Social Reflection, taught by an esteemed professor, Robert Coles, and threw myself into reading and writing personal essays, many of which had to do with the time that I spent with my family in India. And writing those essays stirred something in me, but I didn't know what it was exactly. Then I went to medical school, and I had no time for writing, and barely any time for reading beyond anything, beyond the science that I had to cram into my head. So writing took a back seat, and it stayed that way through medical school, and then residency, and then young motherhood. It wasn't until about 2011, when my kids were in school and I'd been practicing internal medicine for a while, that I thought, how do I go back to being creative? So I started taking writing classes, online at first, but then in person. And it became obvious to me that I wanted to write books for kids because the stories that I read when I was a kid were the ones that had the biggest influence on my life. So I met these other writers, we formed critique groups, and when you have friends saying, what happens next, you have to keep going. You have to figure out what happens next and you have to write it. So eventually I finished and revised a novel called Midsummer's Mayhem, which can be briefly described as a mashup of A Midsummer Night's Dream and Cupcake Wars. And I sent out query letters to lots of literary agents. And I have to tell you, as a person who had been reasonably successful in life up until that point, getting rejection after rejection and no after no really wasn't easy for me. At one point, after many revisions to the story, I had several agents who were interested in reading the whole thing, and after that, I didn't get a no, I didn't get a yes, I got nothing. I didn't know the term ghosted back then, but that's how I felt. It was really discouraging. So one day in 2017, I was in the kitchen with my kids, and I told them that I was giving up on writing, or at least on being published. I said, look, no one's getting back to me and it's making me really sad. I already have a job, and I have you two, I have your dad and the dog. I have enough to be getting on with. And my kids said to me, they said, Mom, we've read your stories, and we think they're wonderful, and we think other kids will too. And then they also said, you know, you always told us that when we really wanted to do something and people told us no, that we should keep trying, that we shouldn't give up. So when your own children, I know, when your own children give you advice that you once gave them, you have to listen. So I didn't give up, and sure enough, within a few months, I signed with my agent. So I just want to pause here and spend a moment thinking about mentorship. So we often think about a mentor as somebody older or more experienced than we are, a parent, a teacher, or a professor. And we think about the relationship going from the mentor to the mentee, right? But that relationship goes two ways, right? Mentees teach mentors as much as we teach them. And that is true in particular, of children who remind us of what it is to have purity of heart and purpose. So since that day, I've sold over 25 books, 15 of which are already out in the world. I write middle grade novels for people ages 8 to 13 and picture books for the young and the young at heart. Some of my themes in my books include family, friendship, coming to terms with feelings of displacement and identity, as well as nonfiction books on medical topics and about math and science, because I love them. When I wrote Red, White, and Whole, the idea started in my head as a metaphor, the metaphor of blood and all that it means in terms of biology, but also in terms of family and community. Written in verse, Red, White, and Whole is set in 1983 and is about a 13-year-old girl. I was 13 in 1983. Whose name is Reha, who feels torn between the worlds of her Indian immigrant parents and her friends at school. Like any American teen, she wants to listen to awesome music, wear cool clothes, go to a middle school dance. But her parents, especially her mom, feel that she has better things to do with her time. So Reha is struggling with this when she learns that her mother has been diagnosed with a kind of blood cancer called leukemia, and her whole world turns upside down. She feels that if she could just be the perfect daughter, the daughter that her parents want her to be, that she can somehow save her mother's life. So, although this is a work of fiction, the emotions in the story were lifted directly from my own life, being torn between the Indian and American sides of myself, wondering whether I truly belonged, and contending with my own mother's serious injury in a car accident when I was a teen. So Red, White, and Whole is a story about being caught between here and there, before and after, and finding a way to be whole. And in it, I hope to convey to readers that we can be stronger because of, and not just despite, the things that we struggle with. So Red, White, and Whole is a book of my heart, in case you can't tell, and I've been so honored by the many accolades it's received. When I was a kid, as much as I loved books, I never saw myself an Indian American in a book, not in the US and not in India. So maybe some of you in this room understand how that feels. Maybe some of you still feel that way. It wasn't until I was an adult that I finally read a book about somebody like me, and it was world-changing. And that is why I write what I write, so that people like me can see themselves in the pages of a book and realize that they can be the heroes of their own stories, and so people who aren't exactly like me can feel the same way and understand how much we share. So I'm going to end with some advice for those of you who are getting ready to launch or helping someone else to launch. First of all, I want to remind everyone that none of us is just one thing. That although we may be torn between different parts of ourselves, we can still be whole people. I'm an example of that. I want everyone in this room and watching and listening tonight to know that we belong. Right here in this room, in this state, in this country, on this earth. And we have the power and the obligation to create communities in which everyone feels they belong, no matter what we look like, where we come from, how much money we have, what language we speak, what religion we practice, or who we love. And finally, I want to say that we are all constantly telling stories about ourselves, and to each other all the time. And so I challenge you, mentee or mentor, young or less young, to ask yourself, what is my story and how do I want to tell it? Maybe you'll tell it in a classroom, or maybe you'll tell it in a boardroom, on a sports field, on stage, in an art studio, in a science lab, in music, or in writing. But whatever your story is, make sure you tell it, because the world needs to hear it. We are all creative creatures, and I encourage you to all draw upon that creativity to launch the next phase of your life, whatever it may be. Thank you.